Welcome to Breaking Convention.
The theme that William raised of the symbolic imagination. I was in the religious studies department here for 10 years, so I'm approaching this theme of the conference from a slightly different angle to most of the talks so far. We've talked a lot about visionary experiences this weekend, but we haven't looked so closely at the mode or faculty of cognition involved in recognizing visionary images as real, as inhabiting a distinct, albeit non-material dimension. I'm particularly interested... Can you hear? Is that better? Okay. I'm particularly interested in the cosmology of esoteric philosophy because it gives cognitive power to the symbolic imagination as an organ of spiritual perception. The imagination is then not mere fantasy, but a place where spirit takes form and shape, as in a mirror, accessible to human senses. In this presentation, I'm drawing on the tradition of Neoplatonism through the thought of the 12th century Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, who provides us with a theory and rationale for distinguishing between imagination and sense perception in the vision of transpersonal realities. I believe this is relevant for our studies of altered states of consciousness of all kinds, including psychedelic, for the empirical and rational mode of knowing is of a different order entirely to the imaginal mode, and not adequate to its noetic order of truth, which requires a symbolic discourse. Here is a poem by Ibn Arabi on his personal encounters with spirit beings. One embodied himself to me in the earth, another in the air. One embodied himself wherever I was, another embodied himself in heaven. They gave knowledge to me and I to them, though we were not equal, for I was unchanging in my entity, but they were not able to keep still. They assumed the form of every shape, like water taking on the colour of the cup. To understand the power of the cognitive imagination, we must enter the archetypal cosmos of esoteric philosophy. Here, the three worlds are mirrored in the human soul in three ways of knowing. The imagination is the middle ground between two loci of vision and partakes of both. The spiritual world, or what he calls the real, can only be tasted through its representations in the imagination as symbolic images or visionary beings, which reveal themselves to the senses in order to be known. Human beings, therefore, have two eyes. This metaphor of two eyes becomes very important in this tradition, the eye of reason and the eye of revelation. And these eyes must become focused as a single vision, and this happens through this middle realm of the imagination. So what is the imagination in this way of thinking about it? Ibn Arabi says the degree of imagination embraces that of sense perception and meaning. Hence, it subtilises the sensory object and it densifies the meaning. It brings the two extremes together. Imagination brings spiritual entities into relationship with corporeal entities by giving incorporeal realities the attributes of corporeal things. Imagination allows unseen realities to be described as possessing attributes that pertain to the visible world. Unseen things actually take on visible form in the imaginal realm. Now, the inhabitants of these three worlds are of different kinds. They have different qualities or densities of being. In the divine world, we find the angels, which are simple, unified spirits, described as pure life, pure intelligence and luminosity. In the material world, we have humans with inanimate and compound bodies. And in the imagination, in the middle world, we find what's called in this tradition the jinn, or the daemons. Spirits which are both simple and compound simultaneously, spirits which interpenetrate with a subtle body, we might perhaps call the astral body, and intermingle. And where spirits appear to become embodied, and where bodies appear to be spiritualized, as in dreams and apparitions. Now, spirits may be perceived by either the senses or the imagination. By the eye of sense perception, which sees during wakefulness, and by the eye of imagination, which sees during sleep, but which may also see during wakefulness by the sage or the initiate in the Sufi tradition. So we have wonderful quotations like this. The person who undergoes unveiling sees while he is awake what the dreamer sees while he is asleep. Thus the dreamer and the unveiler can perceive a reality which is neither fully sensory nor purely spiritual. Now, when spirits become materialized, it may be difficult to recognize them as spirits. And Ibn Arabi gives us this idea that to recognize a spiritual being requires that you recognize a certain mark. He says some people distinguish the spiritual reality that becomes embodied in the outside world from a human being or from whatever form in which it manifests itself, but not everyone distinguishes that. They also discern between a spiritual, supraformal embodied form and an imaginal form within by various marks that they recognize. I have come to know and realize these marks, but the common people do not distinguish them. And Ibn Arabi's, one of Ibn Arabi's greatest commentators, William Chittick, remarks, the Shaykh could live joyfully in the knowledge that he recognized the mark of every apparition. The rest of us, lacking in marks, had best be careful. Another danger is that the distinguishing of different levels of spirits, as the lower levels of the jinn and the satans can lead people astray and deceive them. For the jinns can never directly convey the divine knowledge from above, only superficial information which may deceive the medium or the visionary. So because of what the jinn report to their human sitting companion, he has imaginings about the occurrence of events and what is happening in the cosmos, for they acquire that through listening to the higher planum by stealth. Then their sitting companion supposes that God has honoured him. So what are the elements that contribute to these visionary experiences? There are four main ones outlined by William Chittick. You have the consciousness of the subject who observes the vision, the reality of the object undergoes the imaginalization, the form taken by the imaginalized object, and the cosmic location of the embodiment. So regarding the consciousness of the subject then who observes the vision, this may be gained whilst awake through the eye of sense perception or through the eye of imagination, and then whilst in an altered state through dreaming or through states called absence or annihilation when the soul leaves the body through various meditative contemplative means. Regarding the reality of the object undergoes the imaginalization, well, the gods, angels, jinn and humans may all manifest themselves in imaginal forms. Interestingly, the humans that reveal themselves in this way may be those alive in this world, or ones who are dead but alive in the next world. They can still all reveal themselves as through their imaginal qualities of being, not through their material embodiments. And then the form taken by the imaginalized object. Well, this may be any form. but it must be sense perceptible. And this is where we have a rather confusing idea to think about, because although imaginary things may be perceived by the senses, they are not objectively real in our world, as it were projected into this material reality. And then the cosmic location of the object. Well, this depends on which eye is seeing the apparition. The imaginal being perceived by the eye of sense perception would appear to be located out there in the world of what he calls the discontiguous imagination, while the being perceived by the eye of imagination would be in the inner world, in the world of what's called the contiguous imagination. And the difference between these two eyes is very subtle. It's very easy to confuse the two. So when the angel Gabriel appeared to the Prophet Muhammad as a beautiful Arab youth, his companions only saw the youth, and not the angel. Ibn Arabi describes several types of his own waking visions of spirits. When others were present, but unable to see it, only he was the one who saw it. When others could possibly see it as well as him. And when the apparition was definitely perceived by another. And we have an interesting example. In 1202, he encountered the spirit of a holy man, Arman al-Sabti, who died 400 years previously, when he was circumambulating the Kaaba. He saw a beautiful man who seemed to pass through the bodies of other walkers. He says, "My mind was turned towards him, and my eyes were upon him, lest he slip away. When he'd completed his 7 terms and wanted to leave, I seized hold of him and greeted him. He returned the greeting and smiled at me. All this time I did not take my gaze off him, fearing that he would slip away from me, for I had no doubt that he was an embodied spirit, and I knew that eyesight kept him fixed." So we have this interesting idea that fixing the spirit with the eye somehow allows it to take form, and that embodied spirits then are controlled by human eyesight. Which leads us to sense that it is our quality of perception which allows them to take on human form. So when a person's sight fixes a spiritual being and continues to gaze upon it so that it has no place in which to hide, the spiritual being makes manifest a form to the person, and this form is like a covering over it. The form is related to the spiritual being, just as a light that shines from a lamp into the corners of a room is related to the lamp. When the body of the lamp disappears, the light goes. But the form is not other than the spiritual being itself. On the contrary, it is identical with it, even if it is found in 1,000 places or in all places, and is diverse in shape. If it begins to move and you follow it with the eyes, it will then disappear. Now, the important thing about this imaginal place, this realm, is its ambiguity. For this imagination image is neither entirely existent or non-existent, nearly entirely known or unknowable, neither entirely affirmed or denied. It is to something like this reality that each human being goes in their sleep and after their death, so that person sees moral and spiritual qualities and characteristics as self-subsistent forms that speak to him and with which he converses, as being human bodies without any doubt. And this is this kind of hyper-reality that's experienced in this middle world, which some of us may have had an experience with in various forms. This world, this place, this imaginal reality is called by the Islamic scholar Henry Corbin the mundus imaginalis. And he describes it as a precise order of reality corresponding to a precise mode of perception, a perfectly real world, more evident and more coherent than the real empirical world perceived by the senses. This is a world that requires a faculty of perception belonging to it, a faculty that is a cognitive function, a noetic value, as fully real as the faculties of sensory perception or of intellectual intuition. This faculty is the imaginative power, the one we must avoid confusing with the imagination that modern man identifies with fantasy, and that, according to him, produces only the imaginary. So finally then, what are the implications for research in this area of the nature and quality of spiritual visions? The importance of the liminality of this place, of the mundus imaginalis. It lies in between our normal mode of analysis, of scientific investigation, of empirical information, etc., and some direct spiritual cognition or experience. And it requires, therefore, its own particular mode of understanding and research. The imaginal world is ambiguous, escapes all rational analysis. There's the impossibility of objective empirical assessment according to the laws of the material world. Its reality depends on the psychic ability of the perceiver. And even if seen with the eye of sense perception, then, the spirits are still imaginal in quality and therefore immune to a kind of quantitative research process. Not everyone will see them in the same way. Some may see sensually, some imaginally, and some not at all. But this doesn't invalidate their ontological existence in the mundus imaginalis. Human reason, i.e. what is employed in a sort of scientific methodology, is of a different order from spiritual revelation and is therefore not an adequate means of investigation into the ontology of these beings. Therefore, the investigation must acknowledge the imagination as a faculty of spiritual cognition with its tools of symbol and metaphor, to unveil truths that are inaccessible to the rational mind. Thank you.